Hey guys, long time no talk. The reason why I don't do much of these talking videos during Sculpt January is because recording takes a little bit of time and I just wanted to focus on modeling, really. So I'm kind of really behind on Sculpt January. I believe I'm behind by a week now, and I'm gonna be super realistic with myself and just admit that I'm not going to finish everything by January. Approaching Sculpt January changed a lot for me midway through. I found myself really enjoying the time when I was experimenting with the themes and techniques that I never really would in my day-to-day, and when I was just modeling for the sake of finishing the day's theme, it just didn't really feel right by me. So I started to embrace Sculpt January's themes more as inspiration, and I kind of aim to do more finished pieces as opposed to just modeling. Also because texturing and compositing is one of those things I really like to do, and I didn't want to take that away from myself unless I absolutely knew that I just couldn't do it. So with that in mind, I'm going to aim to finish all 31 themes, even if it's past January, and I'll keep updating you guys through my different social media accounts. But I do want to note that I'm really not going to finish these by January, and for you guys who have been watching these videos, thank you so much. I really hope that you wouldn't be disappointed by this. I'm so sorry about it. Honestly, the experience of Sculpt January has been really incredible for me. I learned a whole bunch in the process. I did a whole bunch of things I would normally never do, and met a lot of cool new artists in the process. So before hopping into the video itself, I just wanted to wish everyone who's working on Sculpt January the best of luck. And for those of you who've kept it up so far, do keep going and keep sculpting away. Moving on to today's theme, which was helmet, I honestly had a very clear vision of what I wanted to make in a sense of, I knew I wanted to make a diver's helmet surrounded by fishes. I didn't know how it was going to look like, I just knew that that was what I wanted to do. And I ended up getting really carried away by this one, and I think I spent about 2 days on and off trying to finish it, which also meant that the recording got really long, and when I was editing the video, I just felt like it would just be a waste of everyone's time if I showed the entire process. So I decided I was just going to showcase key points through the entire sculpting process and maybe talk to you guys about some of what I was doing, you know, if it's something that I find useful or interesting to share with you guys. It's not going to be a tutorial or a walkthrough or anything. It's just going to be me talking about different things in ZBrush as well as what was going through my mind. So yeah, I hope that you guys will enjoy this type of videos. If not, let me know and I'll get back to the usual sculpting and speed through. So I started this sculpt pretty much the same way as I usually do on any type of bust, which would be to use a sphere, and the technique that I use to create heads is basically learnt from just a whole bunch of tutorials and watching live streams. I like to see how different people kind of do this particular process and then take bits and pieces of it which I find very useful for myself. For me, I used to take about 2 hours to get to a point where I find it's a base head. No detail whatsoever, it's just kind of where I can start to sculpt everything else around it. And now, because I've done it quite often, I end up being able to do it in less than 30 minutes. So at the end of the day, it's just a lot of redoing the process again and again. One tutorial that I found incredibly helpful when it comes to creating heads is Danny Mac's Stylized head tutorial. Even though I'm not going 100% stylized for some of my pieces, starting with his particular method has really helped me kind of get to a point where I have a base head and I can start to work everything else around it. So that's a tutorial that I would really highly recommend if you guys are thinking of starting your heads in some way, shape or form. Here you see me kind of use polygroups as well as the crease slice brush to create points where I want the topology to kind of flow through, and then I go over to stroke, curve features and frame mesh, and that will add a whole bunch of curves. And at this point you change your brush to the Z-remesher guides, and when you Z-remesh it, it'll try to follow those areas and curves as much as possible. I find that this method gives a cleaner topology, and that's super important when it comes to sculpting. By the way, just as a side note, because I honestly don't know if it's going to pick up in recording, There's been like earthquakes in Jakarta recently, and I don't know, the weather has been really weird. So if you guys hear like cracks and stuff, I'm not dying, it's just the wind whenever it blows really hard, because my building is earthquake proof, so it kind of moves with the wind a little bit and it just makes a whole bunch of weird metal cracking sound. It's pretty creepy, but you know, that's what it is. Anyway, once I have my ZRemesh generic base head, I start to mess around with the features quite a bit, and at this point is where the character starts to form inside my head. Who she is, what she does, how the image is going to look like, and all of that is currently taking form as I tweak this base mesh. For the head itself, I was really inspired by Audrey Kawasaki, who is one of my favorite artists in life. I look at her work quite often, and recently it just kept nagging in my head that I wanted to do faces resembling her style to see where that goes. So that's really what inspired the look of this. I also used to collect ball-jointed dolls when I was much younger, so that was one of the reasons why the faces I tend to do fall into that type of look. It's funny how hobbies kind of just mold your aesthetics as you're growing up. So if you guys are working in ZBrush, you might find a case where you need a lot more subdivisions on the face, and sometimes if it's connected to the body, you don't exactly get a lot of those. So what I like to do, especially in this case where I know that the suit was going to be, you know, sitting above the head itself, I decided to just group the suit up away from the face, split them up into two different subtools, and that way I can kind of have a lot more subdivisions on the face to work from. And for the suit itself, I panel looped it to give a bit of volume to it so that it can sit above the face, and I just turned off doubles so that it doesn't, you know, create two sides of topology. That way you don't end up doubling your polygon count for no reason. By now I knew 100% that I was going with a sci-fi look. I think I'm going through a phase which I don't even understand because sci-fi is just so difficult for my brain. I not only get really slow with modeling and I make a whole bunch of stupid decisions, but how mechanical parts look and work honestly doesn't compute that well in my head. At the end of this, I think the piece probably looks super simplistic compared to like other hard surface stuff people do, but it took me forever. So I know I need to keep practicing this part of 3D modeling. For this sculpt itself, I tried to predominantly use ZModeler for all the hard surface parts, just because for the pound piece that I did a couple of days ago, I was using a lot of live booleans, and live booleans are super cool, but I knew that because I wanted to texture this after SculptJanuary, I wanted cleaner topology. So either method is really good for hard surface modeling in ZBrush. So ZBrush isn't exactly known for box modeling or polygon modeling, but ZModeler is actually a tool that they introduced for that. It might seem really technical, but I actually think that compared to any other program, ZBrush has the most intuitive and organic way of doing box modeling. It's not technical at all compared to other programs. I learned 3D from Hexagon, which I don't think many people use Hexagon, but Hexagon is a box modeling program, so that's kind of where I learned box modeling from. I do think that box modeling is one of those things that you should understand if you're doing a lot of 3D art. It really trains your brain to kind of understand how to break down complicated items into simplistic form, and I think that that's very useful for both 2D art and for 3D art. And what I like about ZBrush's ZModeler tool is that you can kind of use dynamic subdivisions. So throughout this entire sculpt, even though I was adding pieces after pieces after pieces, you're gonna see that the total polygon count at the top of my screen is predominantly coming from the organic shapes, which means that you can work a lot smoother without taxing your computer too much. So this piece that I'm building is not going to make any sense at all by the end of this particular sculpt, but what I had in mind was that this was going to be a piece that allows the character to issue voice commands to her suit and the helmet, and it also serves as a projector for a holographic screen right in front of her. So all of that is going to come when I start actually texturing that piece, but by the end of it, it was just like a weird piece right in front of her. So one really cool thing that I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about is Nano Mesh. So in ZBrush, we've always had this function called Insert Mesh. And Insert Mesh is going to allow you to take any geometry whatsoever and kind of drag that into your sculpt itself. So in the past, we've always used insert meshes to kind of add screws into, mech pieces. You can kind of use it to add buckles and straps and all that kind of cool stuff. And basically for every single screw and bolt that you see me add into this piece is actually done through the function of either Insert Mesh or this other one called Nano Mesh. So Nano Mesh is something that's pretty new, and it acts a lot like insert meshes. In fact, any insert mesh that you have can be converted into a Nano Mesh. What you want to do is select whatever brush that you want to use as a Nano Mesh, and then after that go to Brush, Create, and then click on Create Insert Nano Mesh Brush. And what that's going to do is going to create a Z modeler brush, and now you can kind of use that to pull out that particular insert mesh onto your object. Only this time it's a Nano Mesh. And what a Nano Mesh is that it's just an instance of the original object. Now you can start to control that through the Nano Mesh palette. So in the Nano Mesh subpalette, you can start to kind of control this particular instance. You can increase the size of it, change the offset, give it a bit of rotation, and just add a bit of variety to all the different pieces that you're adding onto your sculpt. This is a really powerful tool that will allow you to kind of detail out your sculpt really quickly without having to go in and reposition each and every single one of these. And because all of this is just a duplicate of the original object, it's not going to be considered as actual geometry until you convert that into an actual geometry. If you ever do any edits on the original object, it's also going to reflect on all the different duplicates that you've added onto the screen. So yeah, anyway, that was Nano Mesh. I really wanted to highlight this particular technique just because I used it so much throughout this piece and I found it really helpful for myself. You can do this with hard surface items like screws and bolts. You can also do this for any organic items. Basically anything that you want to duplicate, you can do that. I used this on an organic object, which was the fishes at the end of this particular model. So if you guys are using ZBrush and you've never played with Insert Nano Mesh, definitely give it a check. It's a really cool function. So going back to the helmet itself, I actually wasn't very sure where I wanted to go with the design of this. I knew that it was going to be a sci-fi thing, so I started to look for a lot of reference images on sci-fi helmets, sci-fi suits. I was looking at vintage, diving helmets to kind of get inspired from there as well. And nothing really called to me until I remembered that I really liked a spacesuit from the Prometheus movie. So I started to look for still images of the Prometheus movie as an inspiration point for where I wanted to take my helmet design. I think it's so smart, and there were different elements about it that I really liked and thought that it would make a lot of sense in this case. So this particular chest plate thing is actually inspired by vintage scuba diving helmets, which I think are super quirky and really cute. So I wanted to kind of give it a bit of a sci-fi twist. I kept the breastplate where it was kind of in place for those vintage helmets, but I decided to kind of change it into like a screen or a monitor of some sort so that when another scuba diver sees this person, they're able to kind of get a summary of the health and data stats of that person. I don't know. You know what? I really don't know why I'm sharing all these weird backstory that really doesn't even matter at the end of it. But I hope that, when I start to texture this piece, all of this kind of makes sense and I will remember why I did all those things as well if I watch this video ever again. But yeah, so all of those random things are what goes through my head when I'm working on this piece. I had to think of how things were working together, which I don't normally do with organic stuff. And I feel like with mechanical pieces, you kind of have to have a function for every single thing that you put into it. And that really slows down the process because it makes you have to think a lot. It's just a very different style of working, at least for me personally, and I think I should do this a little bit more often with my organic pieces, just because I feel like it adds a bit of credibility, I guess, to the piece. Anyway, at this point, I think I'm just going to play a piece of music and just let the sculpt run by itself. And what I'm going to do is actually take out some bits where I was just experimenting and wasn't sure where I want to go, just to cut the video a little bit shorter and you guys don't have to watch me do the entire twiddling stage. And I'll come back when there's something a little bit more interesting to kind of talk to you guys about, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video. So there we have it, all the different hard surfacing that I did on this piece. I hope I didn't give anyone a seizure. I felt like I kind of had one when I was working on this. And honestly, I took out a lot from this recording and kind of cut things down quite a bit, just because everything was a very repetitive Z-modeler brush kind of approach. I felt like it just wasn't going to be very interesting for you guys to watch. When I was looking at the final model, I felt like everything didn't look quite as complicated as I made it out to be when I was sculpting it. Everything just felt really new to me when I was working on this, and each individual element really wasn't that difficult to do, and just a lot of, Q-meshing things out. But for some reason, when I was trying to integrate everything together, trying to figure out how the tanks was sitting on the cylinder, how the cylinder was connecting to the tube and, to the body itself. So all the integration part of this model was really what fried my brain a bit. And don't get me wrong, I really had fun when I was working on this. The only issue I had is that trying to put this together in a video without being repetitive is just really difficult. So that's why I had to condense quite a bit of that. So at this point, I'm just trying to break up all the hard surfacing that I did by adding some soft elements to it. So I gave the chest piece some soft padding underneath it. For this, I just extruded the piece out and then Dynameshed it, Z-remeshed it, gave it some subdivisions, and then this is when the poly count or the total poly count starts to increase quite a bit. For the different cloth parts, everything I did was just to kind of use clay tubes and standard brush to give it volume anytime I need it. Then I used a lot of Dam Standard, Ops Crack brush, as well as Stylized brushes to kind of add the folds onto the different clothing parts. I did the same for the headpiece that was holding the earpiece to the suit. And then I wanted to move on to the suit and show you guys something I did quite a bit on this model, including the cylinders and the tanks at the back of this particular diver. So panel loops is what I did quite a bit. Panel loops is going to allow you to add really nice segmentation to your pieces. What you want to do is group up the segments that you do want to have, and then it doesn't have to be super perfect because you can add a polish to it while you're doing this. Once you have the different segments that you have, go over to Geometry, Edge Loop, and underneath that, there's going to be Panel Loops. And that is going to be how you can add your panel loops onto the different segments. I tend to switch off double so that I don't get topology in areas that I don't need. And for the cylinders and tanks at the back, I kind of just kept it to 2 loops and then did a very default bevel on it. But for this particular suit itself, I kind of wanted to mix the piping quite a bit. So if I wanted the piping to go out, I would make sure that the inner button was switched on. And if I wanted the piping to go inwards, I would kind of switch that off. And that is how you can kind of get 2 different effects using the same type of panel loops. What's really nice about this is that it keeps the poly groups for you. So if you ever want to split your items into different materials, it's going to be really easy with the different groups that you have. So we're on the finishing stretch of this video, and basically right now I'm just finishing up the organic parts, which is going to be the face and the fish. So I went in and started to add details onto the face, trying to establish the proper muscle structure, and I ended up deciding to keep her eyes closed because, I don't know, it just felt more dreamy that way. But even though the face is not very stylized, but it's not realistic either. For me personally, I like to kind of keep certain facial structures pretty realistic, and that's always been the style that I prefer. So later on when we get to the fish itself, I basically just completed the whole thing with high subdivisions, and I did it on a separate subtool, and then I got the texture and the normals out, but then I decimated it so that I could turn it into a Nano Mesh. But because I was using a Nano Mesh for it, I still had the original version, so if I wanted to change the texture for it later on, I could easily do that. For this particular theme, I decided just to not texture the piece because I knew that I wanted to go into Substance Painter to do it, and that just meant that I have to UV this, and by this point, I was just pretty tired of working on this. So the only part of this particular scuba diver that I ended up texturing was the face, and I kind of wanted to share some texturing tips on skin. So I'm going to play one final piece of music as this goes on, and then come back to show you guys the texturing process that I undergo, and then we'll wrap this video up.
Nobody said it'd be easy, but we took a train to the ceiling, and I'm high on all of my feelings. Don't wake me up from the street. I bought a one-way ticket to space. Let's get out of here. I heard you, but it's nice this time of year. Out in the wild, find our eating. Let's stay a while, never meeting. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Don't let go, I want your body around, all around, all around. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Found you in all of the madness. I heard your voice in the static. Your skin on my skin like a magnet. I won't look down when we crash. I bought a one-way ticket to space. Let's get out of here. I heard you, but it's nice this time of year. You turn my world on its axis. Out here where anything happens. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Don't let go, I want your body around, all around, all around. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Nothing really matters when our love is made of nada. Diamonds start to shatter till we're out of control. Nothing really matters when our love is made of nada. Got me spinning faster till I'm out of control. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. Don't let go, I want your body around, all around, all around. Sound the alarm in my heart. We're taking off. We're taking off. We're taking off.
Loud and clear.
So skin texturing, I actually learned this method from Madeline Spencer over at Gnomon when I was taking a short 10-week course with them. I believe that she covers this in her Gnomon DVDs as well, but later on I kind of found other tutorials and then studied this particular method a bit further and started to implement my own style to this. So basically this entire method just revolves around the theory of having different color zones on the human face, and this is implemented in traditional painting as well. So this particular image is going to depict this entire color zone theory really well. On the top is the basics of what the different color zones are going to be, and then the bottom one goes into greater detail with more values that are being used. When you look at a human face, there's certain areas that take on different color temperatures because of what goes on underneath the skin, from blood to bone to muscles and all that kind of good stuff. It's more predominant in men, so when you're painting females, you kind of want to keep this a little bit on the subtle side. So usually I would always pick an undertone first. So even if it's a creature that's blue, then that's the undertone that I would use, and I would just fill the whole head with that particular color. But for this sculpt itself, I kind of skipped that and kept it white and just went straight into painting the different color zones. So in this particular stage, some people call it the temperature pass, some people call it the clown pass because the end result sort of looks like a clown. So I'm going to take a standard brush and then use a spray stroke with the Alpha 21. And what this combination is going to allow me to do is create some color variety, which will let the skin appear to have a lot more texture than it actually does. So there are three colors that I tend to focus on at this part, which is red, yellow, and blue. Because I don't have an undertone filled, I decided to just use red predominantly on every area of the head. But the color zone that tends to be red is going to be the main middle part of the face, where the eyes, cheeks, and noses are. So these are the areas that tend to be the fleshiest part of the face, and they contain the most blood vessels to it. That's why it takes on a little bit of a rosy undertone to it. The next color I focused on is going to be yellow. For yellow, you tend to want to paint it around the top section of the face, but the reason for that is really because in those areas, there's going to be less blood vessels because the skin is very thin and is very tightly bound around the bones of a human. So if you're painting something else aside from a human face and you're not quite sure where to put the yellow hues, you want to put it at wherever, bone is kind of near the surface of the body. So the skull, the collarbone area, all those parts are going to take on a slightly yellow hue. And finally, the final color is going to be blue. And the reason why blue appears mostly on the bottom area is for several reasons. One, that particular area is often in the shadow, so it's affected a lot by lighting basically. And also, when it comes to males, the hair follicles around the beard area is actually what causes that bluish cast. So for females, the area around the lips tend to take on either a green or a blue hue because of the veins around that area carrying the oxygenated blood. The way that I remember it is that I tend to paint blues basically in the convexes of the face. Anywhere that creates a hollow of some sort, those areas are going to be in the shadow, so I kind of paint it with a blue tinge. So for example, underneath the eyes, underneath the lips, under the nose, in the nose, all those kind of places. And finally, I do sometimes use orange as well. So with orange, you kind of want to paint it around the cheek area because if you kind of touch your face around that spot, it's near the nose where the bone is. So basically the yellows and the reds sort of mix together and it creates that orange cast. So once I do that, I'm going to have this crazy looking texture, but all of that is going to be covered up as we go along. So the next thing that we're going to do is still use the standard brush, but this time changing it to a drag stroke and then use Alpha 45. Pick a white color and lower the opacity and just drag this across the face. If you're doing this professionally, you might not want to use symmetry because it does kind of keep everything looking way too perfect, but in this case, it's completely fine. What we're doing right now is basically trying to mimic the look of veins underneath the skin and at the same time trying to give patches of variety on the skin as well and also blend in all those really saturated colors. So once you do that, the skin takes on a little bit more of a neutral look, and this is when I start to take whatever undertone that I wanted to use initially. It could be beige, pale yellow, peach, or it could be blue if your character is blue. And then I just kind of color fill the head a couple of times with a low opacity. Because this is a female head, I tend to kind of fill it up a little bit more opaquely, and the reason for that is to kind of keep all those different color temperatures a little bit more subtle than if you were texturing a male character. So once I do that, I'll use the same color with a spray stroke and Alpha 21 again, and then just paint over the skin. You can see that as we're doing this, we're covering a lot of the initial clown pass that we did, but the spray stroke allows some of those to kind of peek through, and then having all those vein details underneath it gives the skin a very realistic skin texture feel to it. With the ZBrush material, sometimes you do get lost with the materials itself and then you don't really understand or see how the colors really look. So it's always very useful to have a flatter material just so that you can switch back and forth and see the color a little bit more accurately. So in this case, because her lids are closed, I decided to use the same drag stroke with Alpha 45 again, and that combination with a blue color is just going to add a bit more veining around the eyes. I think that just adds a little bit more realism to that area of the face. So if you're planning to take this into a rendering program to kind of render things out, you can pretty much just leave the skin the way that it is. I do like to add a little bit more depth and dimension, so I take a darker tone as well as a lighter tone to paint in both shadows and highlights. So for shadows, I tend to paint it in the nose, underneath the eyes, underneath the brows, and then for the highlights, I tend to paint it on the center of the forehead and the chin area and the tip of the nose. So with this particular model, we're going with a completely no makeup skin, just natural the way it is, and that's why there's a whole bunch of texture poking through. And if you are looking for something a bit more made up, or if you want to go for a more stylized look, you can definitely kind of keep painting over with the standard brush and no alpha, and it's just going to cover up a lot more. For the hair, I kind of just went with blonde. I didn't do anything very detailed here, it's just kind of filled up with blonde basically, nothing super fancy. So I just kept continuing to add more dimension on the face, and then I start to pick out a red tone for the inner corner of the eyes, as well as the insides of the eyes, because those areas tend to be very red if you look in the mirror. And then for the lips and the nose, I basically just picked a darker red and then kind of going darker on the insides of those things and then getting lighter towards the outside. And that's just how I personally texture skin. Wherever you decide to render this from, this particular texture is going to be able to work really well, especially with a combination of a subsurface scattering material. That's going to add a little bit of translucency to the face and give it a more skin-like quality to it. But having a texture like this is just going to help that material move along a little bit better and give the skin a more believable look. So that's it for this little mini tutorial of sorts. I hope that you guys kind of learned a little bit of something in regards to skin texturing, and this is basically how the final model looks like at this point in time. I hope that I can get to texture this after Sculpt January, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the support that I've gotten about Sculpt January. I've really enjoyed myself, and I'm not super happy about not being able to finish by January, but I hope that you guys are still interested in seeing me work through the rest of the themes that are remaining. So if you guys do enjoy these type of talking videos, let me know and then I'll try and do more of them. But if you're not, then I'm sorry, but there's gonna be a lot more like speed videos versus talking videos, so don't worry about it. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video whenever that comes up, and thank you again for watching this.